Сегодня в гостях у «Русского часа» Абдельвахед Эль Вакил. Большой арабский архитектор, человек с большой буквы, философ и, на мой взгляд, самый яркий представитель арабской интеллигенции. Abdelwahed, welcome to the Russian Hour. It's not the first time we meet, but every time it's a great pleasure. So I wouldn't like to start with politics, albeit it's a trend to talk about the conflict at the moment. But from the architectural point of view, a block of flats that is destroyed in a war can be rebuilt. It's the people, of course, who cannot be unkilled. Talking of wars, I remember that from my history books, over 2 days in February 1945, American and British bombers dropped about 2,500 bombs and I think 1,500 tons of incendiary bombs on Dresden, turning it into an inferno. But by 1969, Dresden was rebuilt. And after the wall fell, its historical buildings were rebuilt as well, fully rebuilt and restored in about 10 years after the fall of the wall. I'm sure the same will happen with Mariupol and other destroyed cities, and hopefully that will take less time. But how about bad architecture in peaceful cities? Will it stay with us forever, or it will somehow this senseless mess will disappear in a peaceful way and will be replaced by something beautiful? What do you think?
I don't know if they will be rebuilt, but I know that some of the old buildings that were destroyed during the war were rebuilt and became very successful event. In London, I live in an area called the Barbican, which was totally destroyed during the war and was built with modern buildings in glass and aluminium. And I had my office there because the rent was cheap. But at night, it was scaring. It was, I even had one of my office architects was stabbed at night with a knife, 6 months in hospital. Why was Barbican a dead area at night? Because of its architecture. Covent Garden was destroyed, but it was rebuilt in the old style. The same thing happened in Lebanon. When I was advisor there, I insisted that they rebuild the old. And they accused me of being romantic, but I was being very scientific because man lives in cosmos and history, in time and space. And a war destroys the memory of a city. So when you rebuild the old of the part of the city as it was before, you bring back that memory. And people are very, very attached to memory because a city without a history is like a man that has lost his memory. These 4 towers become around here, plus 60% more. And instead of having this narrow space between the windows, you have this. This is supposed to be 2 meters, this is 6 meters. But here I have the 8 floors, I put them in 5 floors here.
So On your right, there is a development which would fit the same number of people as the one on the left.
Exactly, and more,
This is amazing.
because this traditional type of thing, first of all, here you have no streets, you have just wasteland around the towers. Here you have the street, and this is how Petersburg was done, St. Petersburg. This is how they were done, the courtyard design. Geometrically by computer, if the land here is 100, here you optimize it to 160, 60% more.
So this is your solution to the problem which we spoke about.
Yeah, first of all, every floor you go higher is more costly and more technology, more elevators, more fire escapes. So if you can build on a plot of land 5 floors instead of 8 floors, you've saved 3 floors. And every floor the contractor does, the higher it goes, it's 10% more expensive. So this is very economical. And then you don't have those towers looking at each other stupidly. You have a courtyard. And from your apartment, you can see the sky. Here you cannot see the sky if you're on the first floor. Just stupid geometry that nobody knows. There it is, you see? Look at here. Look at the angle, 45. Look at the angle here between the windows, 78. There, the same areas on 5 floors, and here on 8 floors. Here no view. Here you have a view of the sky. And you have a private courtyard. Just pure geometry.
Please, let
There
us
it
build
is.
that in Russia.
Look, there it is. All the traditional buildings, courtyards, up to St. Petersburg. Now you have this bastard geometry. There it is, the towers in a garden. Nobody dares to walk there because they get scared.
Or even worse, with no green at all. This is
Yeah.
actually not the worst it can get.
Yeah, this is when it was new. Now all this green's gone. And here you have the styles. You have here the Gothic, like you have in Russia, the old traditional. And this is the Greco-Roman Renaissance, where they took the church and made it into a temple and a bank. And here you have Corbusier style, which is total distortion.
You mentioned Lebanon. I overheard your conversation with a colleague architect from Lebanon. And interestingly, I heard you saying word Solidar, which resembles the name of a city in Donbass, Solidar, where fierce fighting was taking place just a few days ago. So the echoes, the ripple waves of the current conflict sort of, resonate with what perhaps you have experienced over years in Lebanon and in other parts of the world. Did or have wars affected you, your life, your projects in any way?
Yes, I've been, all my life, we've been through wars, 1956, 1967, 1973. And I was in Lebanon, living there. I had started to open an office in the 70s, and then we went through the 20-year war in Lebanon. And then when they started to restore, I came back. President Hariri asked me to come, and I was president of the jury for the reconstruction of the central Beirut. And I insisted that they should restore the old. They wanted to do those towers, but I was very much against it. And I was attacked, but at the end I was proved right, because when they restored the old, you couldn't walk in the streets. Everybody was there from the Gulf, everybody. And this proves the scientific aspect, not the romantic aspect, that man always wants to live in history as much as he lives in space and cosmos. Memory is very, very important for human beings. A city, its beauty is not in its motorways and avenues. It's in the patina of time on the walls of its building.
So one aspect of the current conflict, which is relevant to our discussion, is the attempt to cancel the Russian culture as an example of this overall cancel culture. I remember when there was a conflict in Iraq, the so-called coalition of the willing, mostly the US and the UK, well, they boycotted France. And I remember how in the States France was being punished, so to speak, and the French fries were renamed as freedom fries. French wine was dumped on the streets. And these are just a few examples. So this time it is Russia which is subject of boycott, and interestingly, it is its culture that is in the crosshairs. So how do you explain the phenomenon of this boycott culture? How fair do you think it is? And also I find it quite ironic because obviously both Russia and Ukraine share to a very large extent a common culture. And that is also the reason that this boycott is as inappropriate as it is unfair, one may say. So this whole cancel culture, I think, is totally irrelevant and bizarre. And I mentioned the war in Iraq. Some say about 1 million of civilians died in Iraq war because of the US-British invasion. But nobody stopped drinking Coca-Cola, driving Ford cars, or watching Hollywood movies. So as far as cancel culture goes, to rephrase Orwell, all cultures are equal, but some cultures are more equal than others. So what do you think about cancel culture?
God says in the Quran that we have created you creeds and nations so that you get to know one another. He didn't create us different cultures to have war with each other, but to know one another and enrich one another. And it's very well known that countries that have an open door policy are always economically and culturally very successful. There is an evil hand that is going around our times. When people lose hope of ameliorating themselves, what they call historical inevitability, where divine interference happens. For example, when at the time pharaonic Egypt, the divine interference was that of Moses or Jesus or Prophet Muhammad, our prophet, where you get a divine interference to when the people have no more capacity of improving what they are supposed to do to improve their existence on earth. So if there is no divine interference by God sending us a prophet or a saint or a wise man, Confucius, Buddha, whatever, what happens then is it sends us his wrath, which is like a catastrophe. And I think that our age will have the lesson from divine lesson, not by somebody coming to give us wisdom, but I think it will come from a catastrophe.
God forbid, but it seems that the dynamics are worrying.
Yeah, and now you have COP27 lately in Egypt. You have every now and then a COP something talking about how dangerous the situation is. I attended COP18 here in Qatar, and I gave a lecture there, and we met a lot of scientists, and I came out very depressed because I can see that we are going to a point beyond return. You know, it's like those films of Indians and cowboys where they're canoeing and trying to run away faster, and then at one moment they start going backwards because they reach the point of no return, and then they go over the fall. And we're trying now to stop everything. No, we must have electric cars, we must have, I don't know, natural energy sources, windmills, whatever, but I think we are reaching the point of no return.
Well, you tell me how about in Quran, because in the Bible, of course, the Bible teaches us not to despair, not to be afraid, that indeed there will be news of war, there will be, that all will intensify, but one shall not despair or be afraid. I'm sure Quran also gives that, I'm sure, light in the end of the tunnel, a hope that in the end, evil will not prevail. So it's bizarre that we are talking about all this as if it were, a scene from a movie where one would stand with the poster saying the end is near.
Those people who stand in the street, they have to know the difference between the end of the world and the end of time. People say that a culture will last for 500 years before it starts to decay. It's been now, 500 years since America was discovered. I think it's beginning to decay. It's the end of that culture, the beginning of the end. And I see it, for example, when you have all those shootings, going to war all the time. It was like the Roman Empire also. How did the Roman Empire end also? They didn't stop wars. There's a point where you have to stop having war. But you cannot create war just like that for oil or for whatever needs you have, then you create a war. You know, I see those Indian films, Cowboys, Indians, and when they want to get rid of the Indians from a reservation or everything, they get white men to dress as Indians and attack a white village so that they have an excuse to go and get rid of the Indians.
Old good provocation.
You know, the devil has three prongs in his spear. 3. One is ignorance, the other is greed, and the other is unwarranted desire, ego. So he uses these to poke us as human beings. So you look at the actions happening today. Is it out of ignorance? Is it out of greed? You want something that you can't get? You want oil from this country? You want drugs from this country? You want labor from this country? So you make that country poor so that you can have cheap labor, get a shoe done in Asia for $8, sell it for $80 in the States. So you have to look at these three. If they exist, you know the devil is there. You see, that's the cube here. Now the cube, these dimensions, they are not equal. This is 5 to 6, and up here it's root 5, which is nearly 7. Mm-hmm. And it is not a geometric cube. It's a harmonic cube. So it's related to sound, acoustic. When you open the cube, you get the cross. This is the sides, and this is the top. So when you unfold the cube, you get the cross. And this is how the religions always use the same symbols, but in different presentation.
You are basically saying that the cross is at the heart of many religions.
The cathedral is a cube that is unfolded. That's the plan of a cathedral. Look, that's the plan of a cathedral. If you pack it up, it becomes this. You see, if you open this, and the top comes down, you get the cross. So the symbols are the same for every culture. This is a 3-dimensional cross. In Christianity, you have the heart at the middle, or what they call the sacred heart. What is the sacred heart? In Egypt, it was called the bouncer or the dancer. It's what expands and contracts. It's the whole philosophy. What is the meaning of the sacred heart? It is the sign of life. If you want any life, you put your hand on the heart and see if the heart is beating, that bouncing. They call it the dancer in Egypt because it's bouncing to a rhythm. Boop, 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 boop. That's the heart. So you have the sacred heart is the creation of the universe. And it creates, it's in three axes, six directions, up, down, left, right, front, back. And this is when you cut the cube, the cross, diagonally, you get what? The Star of David. So you have the cross, the cube, and the Star of David, symbols of all the great religions are there. Now, isn't it a miracle that the strongest material, diamond, the structure of it on electronic microscope, it has the cube and the octahedron, those two forms, the cube and the octahedron. And there you see this is photographed here, this cube that expanded. And guess what? When you look at the photograph of the model in plan, you see the yellows here. There is one cross, there is another cross, there is another cross, there is a... So the cube, when it expands, whether you unfold it or it expands, it produces the pattern of the cross. Look at here, you have the void here is a cross. There is a cross. And you have 1 and 2. And if you look at some of the crosses in Russia, you have 2 horizontal ones, one on the top and one on the bottom, and I photographed it when we were in Crimea. Now, am I saying nonsense? Is the cross where Jesus was crucified with the criminals? No. The cross is a symbol not of Jesus on the cross, but it is of this. There is the Coptic cross. It is not the cross of Jesus or anything. It's the cross of the universe.
You talk a lot about religion, Islam, divine, God. When and how did you yourself discover God on a personal level?
In fact, when I was a young man, we had a president, Nasser, who was very friendly with the Russians, and he got the Russians to help build the high dam for Egypt. So at the time, there was a strong propaganda at university to secularize people. There was all this slogan about socialism. We had Marxist news reporters who used to come at the students at university, convince them of Marxism, communism. The Russians were very active in Egypt to sort of introduce this communism, and also in Syria. And then Syria and Egypt made a union. And after 15 years in Egypt, the Russians found they could not influence the Muslim community.
Bolsheviks realized they couldn't influence us Russians because the religion, the Orthodox Christianity, survived the same way.
But the interesting thing is that they say, okay, if you can't get rid of their religion by introducing Marxism or communism or socialism or democracy, which is another religion, unfortunately, which I don't believe in, democracy, I don't believe in it at all. It's a system of administration. It's not a religion that they are trying to tell us in all the world you have to have democracy. Or they say, some country would say we're the only country in the Middle East who has democracy. It's as if it's a religion. No, it was never intended, even in America. It's a sort of hijacking, this democracy thing. So at the time, we had this, and then when it didn't work, we had with Sadat the flip of the coin, where he opened the country and everything, and if it didn't open, then they would say Plan B, instead of getting rid of the religion of Islam, will distort it. And how do they distort it? By introducing fundamentalism and then labeling them with terrorism. It doesn't matter who is behind all this. What matters, because when I speak like this, you say, oh, conspiracy theory, conspiracy. Some people make fun of me and say, oh, another conspiracy theory. No, it's not a theory. And because the devil exists. And one of the most beautiful passages of Dostoevsky in the brothers Karamazov, when the guy was at the end said, if the devil exists, then I have to admit that God exists.
Absolutely.
Because he didn't believe in God, the brother, but when his younger brother killed the father, because of his philosophy, he realized that the devil existed. And Dostoevsky was a psychologist way behind, before Freud or Jung. He was amazing.
I remember that you used to say that Freud is one of those people who got it wrong and who messed things up. Who else would you say are the history's biggest villains, apart from Freud and probably Marx?
You know, Freud spoke of dreams as suppressed desire, frustration. And then Jung went apart from Freud, who was his younger attaché, and at the end he went against Freud and then introduced the symbolic dreams. And he talked of the collective consciousness, and that you know, people have symbols. You know, a dog bites you, that means a friend is going to betray you. You know, things like that. But the funny thing, in Islam, you had Ibn Khaldun. He said, a man has 4 types of dreams. He spoke of the desire, he spoke of the symbolic, and the symbolic exists in the Quran in the chapter of Joseph, and his brothers. And he said that after 40 years, I have to admit that some dreams are illumination from God, because as a scientist, he refused to accept God. And then he said that, but Ibn Khaldun said, desire, symbolism, God, and the other dream is from the devil. So he analyzed 4 dreams way before even the word psychology came out in our lives. The sad thing about Western culture is arrogance. They think that before them, man was just a bit superior than the ape. And that is because of people like Darwin. Although Darwin never proved anything, never proved his theory of this evolution. that an ape can become a human being. And there's always missing links. He never managed to prove it. But it suited the Industrial Revolution to have Darwin's promote such an idea that man came from the ape. And it served them very well, because then they could have black people into slavery without feeling guilty as good Christians. Look at this there. This is the design I did for the crescent of the mosque. You see? And you have this a Turkish one, and this another one also, and this another one. And here this in the museum. There it is. The crescent and the horns are related. They are the crown of the head. They are, and it has more symbolism in Islam, because the word hilal is written with 4 letters exactly as Allah, but in different positions. So it is a symbol of the glory of God. Now, this is the old one. Look at the new one. Look at this bastard. Look how he twisted it. See, there's the old up. This became horizontal, exactly like Darwin. Horizontal X, seeing an ape instead of Adam coming from heaven. And where did this come from? I found it out from cigarettes I was smoking in 1913. They had them in the here, in the cigarettes, camel, and this is like an Islamic city with the crescent going like this instead of up. So this influenced that stupid architect here. And this thing, they took it from the capsule of Gagarin or outer space. No squaring, no dome, nothing. And this minaret looks like a joke. So you have Freud, you have Darwin, and...
Le Corbusier is another villain next to Marx, I suppose, in your book of shame.
Yeah, and I mean, people will accuse one of conspiracy theory, but these things don't come by accident. I mean, you don't promote things like this by accident. It's like Salman Rushdie. He didn't come out of by accident. But it served certain people to have this fanaticism. And unfortunately, Muslims now, they are labeled as terrorists or as fanatics or fundamentalists. But we were never like this. I once was having dinner with an ambassador here, American ambassador in Qatar, and I told him I remember 40 years ago when I just was graduated. I was in my 20s. And because I was from an English school, so all my friends worked either in the American embassy or the British embassy. So I'd go into the embassy, see them. I'd park my car in front of the embassy. I'd walk in, I'd go have a donut in the coffee shop and go around the offices seeing my friends. Nobody stopped me. I could have opened any drawer. I could have been a spy, whatever. But nobody cared. And I asked the ambassador, why in 40 years, less than 40 years, you have now barricaded not the embassy, but the whole neighborhood around it? And I was asked to be involved in the new design of the embassy. And they had offices right on the edge of the property. They wanted to make it like a bunker. And then you couldn't go in, you had Marines, and you couldn't park your car near the embassy because they are afraid it's a bombed car. So I was telling the ambassador, how come Egypt, who in history, the British, everybody who invaded Egypt, they never saw violence. How come in 20, 30 years we became terrorists and criminals and bombers? And Do you think it happened just like this? Our genes changed? Or did you provoke it? There's an American who wrote a book, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And this guy was working for American corporations. He was an agent, spy, I don't know what. But he made his confessions in the book. And their job was to screw everybody. How they screwed in Nicaragua, how they screwed in the Middle East, how they screwed in Asia. Their job was to destroy those nations. So if one of them is now writing a confession, and you have this other guy now, Snowden or whatever he is.
Edward Snowden.
But I personally, in my life, I was very pro-American. I wanted to go and immigrate to America and everything. And I think the American people are wonderful. They are very naive, but they are manipulated very badly. They are, you know, they say that, for example, in our countries we have dictators like Nasser and so on, and we have secret police and we have torture and everything. And we, democratic countries like America, we don't have such things. They have the technology and the knowledge and the science to control people by mind control, by brainwashing them, by telling them lies and make them believe it's the truth.
Yeah. But coming back to the question of morals, or rather divine, from which morals are derived, I was asking you about your personal encounter with God.
I was brought up in a boarding school, English. Then at the time I was at university, there was all this communist, socialist, Marxism. At the same time, I was, because of my English education, I started reading Bertrand Russell, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Marx, Freud. I mean, I was imbued with Western ideas and culture. And of course, as I saw what was happening in Egypt, I said there can be no God. And I got lost. I started reading more books on philosophy, more books on psychology. Why is all this happening in Egypt? What's going wrong with us? And I started convincing myself that there can be no God for what's happening. There doesn't exist God. And that's why I am very touched by Dostoevsky's, that when he said, if there is the devil, then there must be God. Because if there is sunlight, then there must be night. Our world is based on a polarization, negative, positive, feminine, masculine. The whole of creation is a split of the unity. So when I got lost in all this, a friend told me, why don't you do a proper study of the Quran? I have a relative who is teaching at Azhar, and I know your Arabic is not very strong because you've been in a boarding school in English. They used to punish us if we write Arabic, if we talk Arabic. So I said, get him. Let's see what he's going to tell me about all this outdated stuff. I was what, in my early 20s. And this guy came and started reading with me the Quran and deciphering the meanings and the words, because it's a classic Arabic, so many words I couldn't understand. I need somebody to teach me. And he said, why do you want, I said, because I don't believe. I want to read that book and see through it. And I want to prove it's to you that you're just taking it by heritage, that this is outdated. And I started reading with him. And because I had a strong background in philosophy, in psychology and everything, I reached a certain level. And then I said, first we started 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. Then he would stay 6 hours. He'd leave the house at dawn, sometimes when he used to come at night after his work. And then at one time I said, finished. No more lessons. I don't want, you know. So he was going to cry. He said, I couldn't convince you, huh? You still don't believe. I said, no, you don't understand. I don't want to continue because I don't need to. I believe. And he said, how come? I said, because you're not a scientist and your culture is only through the Quran. But this book could not have been written by a human being. This book, the information in it could not be written by a human being. This is a miracle, exactly like the opening of the sea was a miracle for Moses, and for Jesus raising the lepers. The Quran is the miracle of Islam. And not Islam, meaning the Arabs, of the world. It is dictated by God to a man who was illiterate. Our Prophet Muhammad couldn't read or write. This is a miracle in every sense. And I said, finish, I don't want to continue. And he said, why? I said, because now I'm going to work for God. And I was in Saudi Arabia, and I did a beautiful house that was nominated as the best building done in the year 1973 in Saudi Arabia. And the mayor of Jeddah said, I'm ready to give you any project you want. I said, I want to work on the mosques. And he laughed. He said, we only give it to third-grade architects who have no work as a charity. I said, that's why I want to do the mosque. A mosque is not to be done by a third-rate architect. I'm the best, and I'm going to work on the mosque. And 10 years I've been working on the mosques in Saudi Arabia. I stopped doing palace, and I stopped doing, commercial projects. I dedicated myself to doing the house of God. And it's the most beautiful time of my life. And I saw many miracles happening during that period. Many miracles. I couldn't believe it myself.
Thank you very much for this amazing story, and thank you for giving me a title to our feature, Abdelwahed El-Wakil, the man who works for God. And interestingly, I read diagonally for now works by your son, who does something that I think is extremely important, because I feel the same way you feel about Quran, I feel about the Bible, that it couldn't be written without a hand of God. And your son's work inspired me to look for commonalities between stories described in the Bible.
You know what
and-
his work
and,
is? He goes to monasteries looking for the letters of the prophet on how to treat the Christians.
Yes, this is amazing. And just recently I was thinking, it just comes to you. It's like one of those everyday miracles you're talking about. You don't have to really even search for it. I tried recently the best dates I've ever tried in my life. I mean, there is nothing on earth, and do not consider it as product placement, like this Queen One dates that you can only buy in Qatar for now.
Yeah.
They're amazing. They're with halwa, covered with milk chocolate,
Yeah,
dark
yeah,
chocolate, with what have you, with orange, just every imaginable feeling and all that. And I found a passage in the Quran describing how Mother Mary, or Miriam in the Quran, gave birth to baby Jesus. And she...
Under the palm tree, the date tree.
Absolutely. And when the voice said to her, do not worry, because she really was suffering, she was in labor pains. And then dates fell, and these dates preceded the next, if you allow me to think in a sort of filmic terms, the next cut away to the next scene, she comes out with baby Jesus in her arms after eating those dates. And I thought, this must be the same as this Queen Van date, to be honest.
But you missed something here very important.
Please tell me.
Why does the Quran mention the palm date tree? Why wasn't he born under the Christmas tree that you have in every European house?
That's very interesting. Tell me.
Because here is the symbolism that you learn from studying sacred art. The palm tree is called the noble tree because the living part is in the last ring. It's all the rest of the tree is dead. So the palm tree builds on the ancestor. It has history. And every font comes out every moon. So it's a chronology. You can know the dates from the palm tree, and that's why they call it date. Because the palm tree is like a calendar from the fonts that come out every month. And the other thing, because if you cut the top part, the tree is dead, finished. So the living part is the last ring. It's like somebody cutting a human being from his neck. And there's nothing coming below and up. It's only at heaven that it opens. And that is why it's called the noble tree. And the Virgin Mary can only give an immaculate birth under a noble tree, because she gave birth to a noble being. This is the beauty of understanding the symbolism of sacred text. And that is how I fell in love with the Quran, because it was my gateway to recognizing my Creator.
Abdelwahed, we spoke about the human's hills as described by Zamyatin, these monstrosities of residential complexes. We spoke about modernism, we spoke about concrete and glass and all this. And it is, when I witnessed, when you had reverence for Russian architecture, is when we visited churches with you in Russia. I mean, you consider the Russian church architecture as the most noble among all types of Russian architecture, as far as I understand. You admire it. What is it in this architecture that you think is most important?
The spirit of man. Because people didn't build by contractors. And you know, when I was building the mosques in Medina, old people used to come you know, and jump the fence and go into the site and build with the workers. And there was an old man, and you're not part of the contract. What are you doing here? Get out. He said, why do you want to kick me out? I'm not asking you for money. I want to build with you. He wants to participate in the house of God. It was very touching. And an old man, he looked at me like this and said, you think you're building this by yourself? I said, no. He said, no. I said, who's building with? He said, they're all over around you, the angels. So these people are amazing. I mean, the amount of things that happen when you build the house of God is incredible. But if you go and pour it as a contractor, no. They told me they'll, you know, those patterns you have on the wall, geometric patterns, so on. We have a cast, we're going to put it. I said, no. Cast, I don't want anything. I want white walls. He said, what do you want? I said, I want them to carve on the wall. And I got 1,000 Moroccans that carved the gypsum. And they were all perched on the walls. They punch a nail, put this little radio, open the recital of the Quran, and they would keep, you know, carving into the patterns. They wrote on a pencil, then carve the wall, you know, and create the patterns. And when the people of Medina came in and saw them all perched on the walls like this, like woodpeckers, the tears came in their eyes. All this prefabrication, going back to what you told me about those the buildings that were done at the time, prefab buildings that were in Russia and all around the world, and it all failed economically and constructionally, and they're all dilapidated. And in England also, they never worked. The buildings fell apart, the facades, everything.
Let me show you something that is being constructed now. I'll just show you a picture. I wanted to hear what you would say.
Yeah, it's a monster. It's horrible. It's just inhuman.
And this is in China, in Hong Kong.
Oh, I know these also. No, they are a nightmare. These buildings, they are inhuman. Because you cannot have a flat on a 20th, 30th floor and have a link with the garden below. It's not based on individuals living, but on a mass that is sort of undifferentiated. And the worst thing is that these apartments cannot expand. What the English have, they live in very small townhouses, and the Dutch, the best model was taken from the Dutch. And the Dutch had those very narrow facades because of the you know, the dikes, because it's below sea level. So they had to have those very narrow facades, which became the prototype for the English townhouse. But you can expand, you see. Usually what happens, they build a higher floor if they have an extended family. So you can go, I've seen townhouses in England which are 5 stories high. And you can have now very cheap elevators. You don't have to have those big engines. You can have a rotary engine like the ones that lift cars in workshops, you know, they're just an electric. You don't need those huge elevators that before it was very costly to have elevators. Now you can have them very cheap. So you can have a very narrow frontage and deep inside, and you can have the back garden at the back. and the children can play in front of their mother in the kitchen, but you can't have children going down elevators 20 floors, and a lot of crime happens in those elevators. The process of building and what Islam had, which was beautiful, is that the crafts were designed to raise the spirituality of the worker. He wasn't working just to get his daily pay, no. He was working because he would be proud of his production. And with psychology and our modern knowledge of science, we know that working with the hands, because the most beautiful thing in a human being is the hands. When you see a Rubinstein playing the piano and his fingers moving, it's not from here. There is intelligence in the fingers. You can't play piano like this just by looking at the notes. He played like this, Arthur Rubinstein. You see him, he's closing his eyes, playing like that. It's coming out from his hands. And this is the craftsman. His spirit comes out into the building. And that's what makes traditional buildings, you feel the sense of the sacred in it. Because when you go in, you feel the presence of the spirit of the worker who was in it, not a bloody contractor with precast things. This is why the crafts are important and not the robots. Why don't they do this with football? Huh? Why have 11 players on each side? Give each goalkeeper a cannon and let him shoot a goal on the other side. Why? Let's be technical. Let's be high-tech. Why waste our time having people running and yellow cards and fuel and referee and out and in and corner and foul and his leg falls. What's all this stupidity? 2 hours watching people falling and crying and hitting each other and the ball going and coming. No, let's be technical. Give them a good cannon or a Kalashnikov with a big nozzle, put a ball in it, and each one has a shot.
But you know what? Them, as we call them, effective managers, would do just that. Optimize football
they
to
only
just
have
that.
it when there's a penalty. No, you make the whole game like this, and the game is over in 2 minutes. Why waste 2 hours watching a football game? This is how we think about our buildings and our technology. Why waste our time?
Thank you for reminding us how important it is to be a real human versus being a human robot.
And that is why I like very much the Russian icon. Because it's not done by the whim of the artist. It is the clergy, the church, puts the theme, and the artist excels in its production. It's like a Mozart who composes, and you have a grand maestro and orchestra that interprets. And each one has it's like Chopin. The best to interpret Chopin was Arthur Rubinstein. Beautiful. So we are there to interpret the truth.
And as Dostoevsky put it, beauty will save the world. So Abdelwahed, thank you for contributing to saving the world.
Thank you for having me, Alexander. It's a great joy always to be with you and talk, and I'll never forget our trip to Crimea and the wonderful time we had there. Thank you.
There will be hopefully more discoveries that we will make, inshallah.
Inshallah, inshallah. Russia is a great country, not only in size, but it has a great history. And as I told you, I'm person who believes that we do not live in our space like that, but we also live in our history. And you have a great history, and we have a great history of Egypt. I'm I'm very proud to have had as my ancestors the ancient Egyptians. They were great people.
And I'm so proud to sit next to a very worthy descendant of those Egyptians. Thank you, Abdullah.
I have to walk sideways.